Hey, serial streamers, welcome to episode 3 of Serial Streamers. If you're asking yourself, what the hell is Serial Streamers? Maybe this is your first time tuning in. Maybe you're listening on the podcast, which is Murderish, or maybe you're watching me on YouTube. But either way, Serial Streamers is kind of like a book club, but it is a TV club for people who binge a bunch of true crime TV documentaries and TV series. We operate really similar to a book club, only we don't hold our meetings at somebody's house over drinks, although I wish we did. We just go to Instagram. So you just need to follow me at Jami on air. That's Jami on air on Instagram. Every couple of weeks I go on there and I announce the Serial Streamers watch assignment. Then I give you about a week to go and watch the docuseries or TV series. I'll watch it too. Then about a week later, I'll drop an episode on the Murderish podcast feed. You can either listen to that, or maybe you will have already watched the docuseries. You can listen to the podcast and watch the docuseries. And then about a week after I drop that episode on Murderish podcast, I will come back to Instagram, and that's when we hold our TV club Serial Streamers meeting. It's a virtual meeting on Instagram. I'll put out a post, and basically I just open up the chat, and that's where we talk about the docuseries that we watched the week before. Everybody gets to share their opinions, their thoughts, their theories. It's a lot of fun. People have been really enjoying it, including this girl. I mean, you guys are coming through with the most thoughtful theories and thoughts on these docuseries that we've been watching. So if you want to join, all you got to do is follow me at Jami on air. Okay. Oh, and also make sure you hit the follow button and subscribe here on YouTube, as well as if you're listening on the podcast. That way you never miss a new episode when it comes out. You'll get a notification and you'll get to watch it. And then you'll get to come back to Instagram and weigh in on what we're talking about. All right. And who doesn't want to be in the Serial Streamers Club? You guys, this is so much fun. And I know that probably the large majority of people who are listening to true crime podcasts like Murderish are probably out there binging all of this true crime content on TV. I know I am. So this is a really great way for us to talk about it and kind of act like a book club, only better. All right, let's get into it. But before we do, I need to offer a trigger warning on this particular docuseries because it's really dark. It may trigger some people. It deals with cults, sexual assault, rape, and coercive control. So if you are triggered or sensitive about any of those subjects, just please heed this warning that we're going to be talking about all these things in this episode. So take care before listening or watching. All right, you guys, let's get into it. The Serial Streamers watch assignment was Seduced inside the NXIVM Cult. You guys have probably heard about NXIVM. That's NXIVM. I don't know if those are like Roman letters, or I really honestly don't even know what the hell it stands for. But I think it's pronounced NXIVM. I always struggled with that, so that's what I'm going to go with. Don't fight me in the comments over it. This was a Starz original docuseries. It's a 4-part series. You can get it on Starz if you have a subscription. I was able to get it on Prime, and I think I paid $6.99 for it. All right, so the docuseries really is led by a woman named India Oxenberg. India Oxenberg was in her 20s at the time that she joined NXIVM. It was her mother, Catherine Oxenberg, who actually got her into NXIVM, which we would later find out is a cult. So her mother always struggled deeply with that because she's the one who introduced her daughter to this cult unknowingly, not knowing at the time that it was a terrible cult. Now, Catherine Oxenberg, India's mother, she is a gorgeous actress who was prominently featured on the very first Dynasty. I don't know, depending on your age, you'll know what Dynasty is, but I don't know, it's kind of like a souped up soap opera, if you will. Anyway, my mom used to watch it. All right. So India was in NXIVM from 2011 to 2018. And she was, like I said, she was in her early 20s at the time she joined and throughout her time in the cult. NXIVM was founded in 1998 by Keith Rainere as well as Nancy Salzman. And we'll talk more about these two pieces of shit. I mean, these two people. They co-founded NXIVM together and they would go on to lead it. Yeah, I have so much to say about these people. This one really made me angry. I was telling my assistant Alexis that I was dropping motherfuckers like a bat out of hell. I mean, I was talking to myself. I was yelling at the TV. If this docuseries doesn't piss you off to the nth degree while watching it, I don't know what will, but it's absolutely enraging. NXIVM was, before it really found its way to being a cult, and maybe it was a cult from the beginning, but people didn't really start calling it that until they made some discoveries about it. But essentially, it was an establishment that sold people on helping them reach their full potential, kind of a self-help course type deal. So they would sell these inside NXIVM, they would sell these self-help courses, which sounded a lot to me like Scientology. These highly overpriced courses, they're bullshit courses that teach you absolutely nothing, but they sell them, the top leaders of NXIVM and Scientology, they sell these courses so that you can kind of like move through the program, for lack of a better term. And it's just a bunch of fucking bullshit. People drop all their money on these things. It's a complete waste of time. And then they never get that money or that investment back. And I rolled my eyes so hard at NXIVM and Scientology and certain, actually all MLMs, but especially the MLMs that prey on, that are self-help type deals. So, you know, they would talk about this at the end of the docuseries, that the self-help industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry that is wildly unregulated. So people just go wild with this shit. And I think that they, you know, self-help organizations, MLMs, cults, whatever, you know, pyramid schemes, what have you, gurus, they play into people's vulnerabilities, and they claim that they're going to help you become a better person, reach your full potential, break through your trauma, break through your fears, like just all this bullshit. So I was already on high alert that NXIVM, that was kind of like the format that they played under. It was like a self-help type organization. There's just so many scams. It's just ridden with scams, that industry. It's not to say that there aren't actually genuinely helpful self-help individuals, professionals, groups, things like that. But it's just the kind of thing that I just give immediate side eye to. It's just one of those industries. The leader of NXIVM was Keith Rainere. Now, he was in his 50s during his reign of power within this cult. And he and most of the high-ranking members of NXIVM all lived in upstate New York in Albany. I don't know, maybe New Yorkers call it Albany, but, you know, I'm a Southern California girl, so I really have no clue, but Albany, tomato, tomato. Keith Rainere was born in Brooklyn, and he worked as a computer programmer prior to establishing NXIVM. And apparently his father, James, had told him at one point in his life when he was younger how gifted and talented he was. And apparently from there, Keith just took on an extreme superiority complex. He just thought he was God's gift, or like Jesus himself, after his dad gave him this compliment. Rainere's parents divorced when he was 8 years old. He became the primary caretaker to his mother, who actually died when he was 18 years old. Nancy Salzman is the co-founder of NXIVM, and she was the president of NXIVM after it was established. She was in her 60s during her reign of power in NXIVM, and she was formerly a psychiatric nurse. The only way, as it was described, the only way to move up in NXIVM was to bring in other people, which sounds really, really familiar. Let me think why. Oh, MLMs. NXIVM reminded me of like a hybrid between Scientology and MLM with some nasty sex abuse mixed in. It's just the worst of the worst. But yeah, apparently, you know, to move up in this organization, you had to go out and recruit other people. And of course, that's to keep the wheels spinning. That's to keep the money flowing in. And that is to continuously keep feeding Keith Rainere's highly inflated ego so that he could have all these women just fawning over him. And we're going to get into that. Another aspect of moving up within the organization or the cult is to take more courses, so that they force you to take these courses. And of course you have to freaking pay for them. And they range anywhere from like $2,000 to $5,000 to $10,000 plus per bullshit course. It's essentially a pyramid scheme, an MLM, a money grab. Within NXIVM, they rewarded obedience. Yuck. The NXIVM Stripe path was a ranking system similar to martial arts. So as it was explained in the docuseries, once you master one level, then you've got to master the next, and then you can start teaching within the cult. I'm going to listen, these people called it an organization or an establishment or whatever. We're just going to call it what it is. It was a cult. But of course, the people within it, most of them, I believed, or if not all of them, except for Keith Rainere, believe that this is a legit organization, right? That they're actually doing good for themselves and other people. I mean, maybe at one point they turned and they were aware that it wasn't such a good place, but we're just going to freaking call it a cult because that's what it is. So once you earn your yellow sash, then you can start teaching and coaching within the organization. But that doesn't mean you're making money, because you can't make money within NXIVM until you become a proctor. And apparently a proctor is an orange sash. Once you get that, that's really the only way you can start making money. And apparently senior proctors made a pretty decent living. They had a green sash. So a senior proctor could make pretty darn good money. And they made commissions off of every single person that was brought in under them. Again, MLM. In reality, though, it had nothing to do with people's merit as far as them moving up within the organization. It would be discovered that, apparently beautiful and thin women would move up really quickly within this cult. And that's because Keith was pulling the strings and he liked beautiful, thin women. And really, what unbeknownst to most or all of these women, they were not earning this. This was not based on their merit. They were being trafficked and they were being groomed to essentially become a slave of their grand master, which is Keith Rainere. Michelle Chernitsky, who was a proctor within NXIVM, India Oxenberg and him met in NXIVM. And she thought that they could build a really great relationship. But Nancy Salzman, the president and co-founder, and essentially Keith's bitch, she had a lot to say about this relationship and she injected herself into the relationship. Essentially, Chernitsky was a higher rank than India. So Nancy set these rules and boundaries for their relationship, which again is just an example of her and other executives exerting their control over lower ranking members. At one point, while she was in NXIVM, India ended up taking a job out of the country. She was going to be working as the assistant for Pierce Brosnan, the actor, in Belgrade, Serbia. Now, she received a major guilt trip from the executives of NXIVM. Essentially, they gave her an ultimatum. They said, you need to be all in on NXIVM. They kept pressuring her to quit that job. At one point in her life, India had received a sizable inheritance from her grandfather, which was supposed to be allocated for her college, but she spent every single dime in NXIVM on these bullshit courses. In the docuseries, at one point, they bring up the I don't know how to say this. The Jness Tracks, Jness. The Jness Tracks teaches women, mostly women, a lot about how it's not normal for men to just be with one woman. It's normal for them to want to be with more than one woman. And so essentially this is just grooming these women for being okay with them being monogamous and loyal to their master, a man, but he can go and sleep with whoever the hell he wants because that's just what men do. India's relationship with Michelle ended up getting much worse. She thought the whole time that it was a monogamous relationship. She comes to find out that many of the NXIVM couples were actually swapping partners the entire time. All right, so there was there's so many disturbing parts to this docuseries that I just cringed and shed some tears over. It was hard to watch. So trigger warning, at one point, the Jness Tracks, basically Keith was teaching a course and he was speaking in a packed room of NXIVM members, and he's teaching them, probably during the Jness Tracks courses, he was teaching them about rape. And he says, essentially he blurs the lines between what is abuse and what is not abuse. And what he goes on to say, and don't quote me on this, but he says something like, he preaches the idea that rape wasn't rape if the victim didn't see it that way. He goes on to say that regarding the word abuse, he says the person who is self-victimizing is abusing. The person who's complaining is abusing. So he twists this widely held belief. We all know that rape is bad, but he's softening them up to say, well, if the victim doesn't see it as rape, then it's not rape. And it's the victim who's complaining about it. They're actually the one abusing. I mean, it's absolutely wild that these words came out of his mouth, and it's about to get worse, which we'll get into. So what Keith is doing this entire time is he's slowly creating an environment for him to reach his goals, to sexualize and control women. That is what it was all about for him. He's manipulating every single person within NXIVM. So the docuseries at one point talks about radicalization, the SOP courses. SOP stands for Society of Protectors. Keith at this point talks about how people bond through pain. So during the SOP courses, the NXIVM members were subjected to other people slapping them. They had to do an extremely high number of planks, push-ups. They couldn't eat, drink, or pee unless given permission. I mean, this is just torture and abuse. And within NXIVM, it is just peppered with extreme misogyny. It's essentially getting women to hate themselves and to be subservient to men. They would make fun of you. They would demean you. They gave India a mantra at one point that she had to keep repeating over and over and over. And her mantra was, I am nothing. I have no real emotions. So they're just essentially stripping these women's minds so that they're just blank and malleable so that Keith can do whatever the fuck he wants to do. Within NXIVM, there's also this thing called readiness training. And one of the leaders would text their team of 6, they would text them ready with a question mark. And the team of 6, within 1 minute's time, they have to immediately reply ready. And if even one of them texts a second after a minute, that means they all fail. And essentially this is teaching them to obey and obey immediately. In 2003, this, I believe, is the first time that a story comes out about NXIVM potentially being a bad organization, potentially being a cult. And it's a Forbes magazine article from 2003. The head of Seagram's Liquor, the multi-billion-dollar, multi-million-dollar brand, whatever it's worth, the head of Seagram's Liquor, which is Edgar Bronfman, his daughters were deeply involved in NXIVM. I mean, they were just loyal as loyal can be. And they essentially, NXIVM and Keith Rainere had drawn a wedge between the two Bronfman daughters, Sarah and Claire, and their father, Edgar. And he hadn't spoken with them at the time the Forbes story broke. He hadn't spoken with them in months. And Edgar, after this article came out, he was declared an enemy. That's what the cult used to call anybody who spoke badly about them. And Edgar did refer to NXIVM as a cult in that article. And it's very similar to Scientology. You know, in Scientology, if my memory serves correct, they would call these people suppressives. They did the same thing in NXIVM. They called these people who talked badly about NXIVM, they called them suppressives. So it's just odd, the similarities between the two organizations, the two cults, in my opinion. And Claire and Sarah Bronfman were huge assets to NXIVM. Essentially, their extreme wealth funded Keith and NXIVM. They were worth multi-millions of dollars. So it was like an endless supply of money whenever Keith or NXIVM needed it. And they were always right there, ready to open their wallets up to the cult. It also came out in this docuseries that Keith Rainere and Nancy Salzman, the president, used to hypnotize people, which is very, very dangerous to do. You really cannot be playing with people like that. But of course they did. And Nancy Salzman previously worked as a psychiatric nurse. I don't know if she learned that as part of her being a psychiatric nurse or if that's even a thing. But apparently they did used to hypnotize members, which is just wild. Kristen Snyder, at the time of her death, was 35 years old, and she was a NXIVM member. Now, she disappeared in February of 2003, and she left behind a suicide note. Whether it was written by her or not remains a debate today. But in the note, she said she had attended some NXIVM courses that had stripped her mind. And in the note, she says, "There's no need to search for my body." Now, other people believe that she was killed or harmed or made to disappear by people involved with NXIVM because allegedly she had shouted out during a NXIVM course that she was pregnant with Keith's baby. Rainere would later say that, Snyder's death, it was a hoax and she's probably just hiding somewhere in Mexico. So I don't really know what the truth is. Now my curious brain wants me to dive into this and find out what really happened to Kristen Snyder. But as far as I know, it remains debated today whether she died by suicide and actually wrote that note herself, or she was made to disappear and something nefarious happened to her. 4 years into her NXIVM membership, India was still with Michelle. She was living in Santa Monica at this time, and he ends up pressuring her to take the ethicist course within NXIVM. And apparently Keith was going to be teaching it, so he thought it was very important that she take this course. In the course, they taught ultimate devotion. The ethicist course is essentially like, how much are you willing to do for Keith Rainere? Would you die for him? It softens people up to the idea of them saving the world, so anything Rainere asks them to do is justified and worth it, even if it means them dying for him. And it's very similar to Waco and Jonestown, what happened in Jonestown. And we all know how that ended. It also came out during the docuseries that Rainere would always exaggerate his education. He told people he was a triple major, he had 3 graduate degrees. In reality, the dude was on probation in school numerous times, and his final college GPA was 2.26. So he wasn't a genius, as he proclaimed. He was a complete liar and scammer. And tell me you're insecure without telling me you're insecure, right? I mean, this guy has got to be the most insecure motherfucker on the face of this earth. I mean, everything, the power and control that he wanted and the inflated sense of self, it just tells me like you have no security. You're not secure within yourself at all. And I thought this was freaking hilarious. Rainere apparently claimed that he was the Guinness World Record holder for the highest IQ on Earth. I mean, not the highest IQ in the United States or in, a certain geography, like literally on fucking Earth. Who says on Earth? Like, it just reminds me of like when my son was little and like he was having like a pissing contest with a friend. He's like, yeah, my dad can beat up your dad, or my dad's, it just is fucking ridiculous. And like, ladies, dudes, if you're dating somebody and they're like texting you and telling you all these great things about themselves, and they're like, they're always like the best of whatever they say they do. For example, if they play football and you're like, oh, what position do you play? And they're like, oh, quarterback. It's a red flag. It's not to say that they aren't the star of the show, but it's like, dude, couldn't you just like kick it down a few notches? I mean, does your IQ have to be the highest on Earth, or could it just be like the highest in the United States? I don't know. I think he like blew his wad on that one. That is like a huge red flag if somebody's like, I am the best on Earth. Anyway, but that's so Keith Rainere, isn't it? But it would also be revealed that he was only mentioned in one edition of the Australia version of the Guinness Book of World Records. So this is highly sus. I mean, it sounds like he paid somebody to appear in the fucking book in another country one time so that he could always point to that one, edition and be like, look, there I am, highest IQ on Earth. I can't. In 2015, India is traveling from her home in Santa Monica to Albany, New York, constantly to take these bullshit courses. At the time, Allison Mack, who was an actress well known for her role on the show Smallville, Allison Mack, was teaching many of the upper level courses at that time. Now, Mack was promoted to proctor, so she was, in theory, making money, although we would come to find out later that Rainere wasn't paying her when he should have been. So Allison Mack, and at the time, India looked up to Allison Mack. Allison Mack had just moved up so quickly within NXIVM, which is no surprise. She's a beautiful, small woman, just like Keith Rainere liked. But she moved up very quickly to proctor, and that's what India wanted. So she, saw her as a mentor, and she looked up to her at this time. Allison Mack joined in joined NXIVM in 2006 after attending a jeunesse course, which was likely sold to her as being a supportive women's group. That's kind of how it was sold to all women before they joined certain factions of the cult, if you will. Like, oh, you should join this part of it. It's a really supportive women's group. When in reality, it's just getting you closer and closer to being sexualized and trafficked by Keith Rainere. And at one point, after India starts to get to know Allison Mack a little bit better, Allison Mack approaches India and says, hey, I have something that could help you. She says, but I'm going to need some collateral from you before I share this secret. So it's blackmail. So anytime that the higher-ups of NXIVM, like Allison Mack, who was a proctor, wanted to bring on more people under her or under Keith, however it worked, they would ask for collateral. And collateral could be nude pictures or videos of them. It could be deep, dark family secrets that they share with them. Essentially, it's blackmail, so that if they ever are a defector from NXIVM or don't follow through with their loyalty, and they're no longer loyal, Keith and or whoever within NXIVM Cult can bring out this collateral. And people are afraid. I mean, India says a million times throughout the docuseries that she was always so nervous and anxious over what she had shared within her collateral. I mean, she, her family could be exposed. There may have been nude photos and videos. She just has no idea what they can do with this information that they have holding over her head. So it really did always keep her in line, and is what it was designed to do. So Allison asked India to get a letter she'd written as collateral, which was essentially exposing some of her deep, dark family secrets. Allison tells her that she needs to get this letter notarized, and she needs to write it in the form of a media or press letter. And that just tells you, like, that if they're going to use this collateral against India one day, it's already ready to go. Like, it's ready to just shoot out to the press for the public to see. And India does in fact give Allison the collateral. And then Allison tells India about DOS, D-O-S. She tells her that DOS is women mentoring women in a very deep way. And she was also told, India was told by Allison, that Keith wasn't involved in DOS. Now, DOS stands for Dominus Obsequious Sororium, which is loosely translated in Latin to be master-slave sorority. And then Allison would slowly drip more and more information out to India about DOS. And she would tell her more and more about it. Essentially, DOS wanted ultimate and complete obedience from the slaves to the masters. So Allison Mack would have been India's and was India's master. And India was considered a second line slave or a first line slave. I can't remember which one. I think she was a second line slave. There were like first line slaves, second line slaves, third line slaves, and so on and so on and so on. But Allison then twisted it, in true Keith Rainere fashion to India and tells her that it's not really, a master slave dynamic. It's more of a mentor-student dynamic, which was bullshit. And India was really afraid that Allison was going to hurt her or expose her collateral, her family secrets, because she didn't really know Allison very well at this time, but she was putting a lot of trust in her. And in fact, she did trust her enough, and she accepted the opportunity to be in DOS, this secret world where now India was going to be a slave and Allison was going to be her master. At the time that India joined DOS, I believe there were about 150 DOS members, masters, and slaves. And NXIVM members didn't know about DOS. So it was really only DOS members, the 150 slaves / master and masters. They were the only ones who knew about DOS. Anybody else within NXIVM was never to know about DOS. It was a secret. Immediately after joining DOS and becoming a slave of Allison instructs India that she's going to need to lose some weight. She tells her this is a practice in self-control. India says that Allison also encouraged her to end her relationship with Michelle at that time. And Allison was particularly interested in India journaling about things that made her feel vulnerable and uncomfortable, but particularly when it came to her sexuality. So Allison was really trying to get particular information out of India. And of course, this was all for Keith. Allison tells India, I want you to lean into your fear and discomfort. She gave her an assignment at this time, and the assignment to India was to seduce Keith, which I nearly vomited at this point. I mean, if you see Keith, he's just a little motherfucker. And if it wasn't for his manipulation and bullshit and the spell that he had these women under, like nobody would touch his ass with a 10-foot pole. I'm telling you. Just Google him. Now, India is told this is a seduction exercise, and many women are asked to do this. And the end result was going to be some sort of sexual encounter with Keith Rainere. Allison Mack tells India that she needs to have Rainere take a picture of you naked to prove to me that you did the assignment. So again, they're gathering more and more collateral, like it's just never enough. India felt extremely uncomfortable with this. She was embarrassed, but she went through with it. She sent a naked picture. She posed. Rainere took the picture. She felt like she was in an altered state during that time. And it sounds like she just sort of like left her body in that moment. And I can totally understand. Not that I've been in that situation, but you can just understand as a woman or as a person who's being victimized, doing something that you don't want to do, that you're extremely uncomfortable with. You know, you have this escapism thing where I think that you can sort of leave your body in order to go through with something that you absolutely do not want to do. And then Keith goes on to tell India that I'm Allison's master and I'm your grandmaster. After that encounter with Keith, India was convinced by the higher ups within the cult to move to Albany at the age of 24 years old. She tells her mom that Keith was going to mentor her. She ends up moving in with Allison Mack at her condo. At this time, India was sort of managing Allison's home for her. She cooked for her. And at this time, India is still a coach and she's making zero money in this cult. Now, her being pressured to move to Albany, along with Allison and so many others, is really a way for Keith Rainere, the leader, to keep tabs and have ultimate control on the members because they all lived near him so he could keep an eye on them. At some point, Keith decides that India needs to be 106 pounds, so specific. And Allison tells India, who is her slave at this time, she can only eat 500 calories a day. And she had to ask her master if she could have a 100-calorie meal before she ate it. It was complete control, abuse, malnourishment. It just made me sick to see this. Women are essentially being starved. Their hair is falling out, including India's. The women in charge would tell these people, including India, that this was all normal and they'd experienced it too and she would get through it. At one point, Allison and her slaves go on a trip to the Berkshires, and Allison tells the girls, we're going to take a family picture. Only they're all instructed that they have to be nude in this picture. And Allison tells the girls, don't worry, this is just for us. But she ends up sending it to Keith, who responds in a text message saying, all mine, with a devil emoji. So essentially she's sending these nude family pictures to Keith, and he writes back right away saying, all mine, ? With a devil emoji. It's just disgusting. Now, one of the slaves, Nicole, ends up getting really pissed off because she finds out that the picture is sent by text message to Keith after Allison said, oh, this is just for us. And she says loudly, if it's just for us, then why is Keith getting the picture? And she asked if Keith was getting aroused by the pictures. Isn't he supposed to be holy, yet he's sending a devil emoji? So she's really pissed off and questioning why the hell he's getting this text message. And Allison is really defensive. And she's like, how dare you accuse me of that? Don't you trust me? So she goes on to punish her slaves. She says to them, after this loud outburst by Nicole, Allison tells her slaves, she says, I'm going to take close-up pictures of your pussies. It's just absolutely so derogatory, so demeaning, so disgusting. So India strips down nude. She stands in line, and Allison, one by one, takes pictures of all the girls' genitalia. And of course, those pictures were probably sent to Keith. At some point, Keith starts hounding India all the time for explicit photos. Specifically, he wants close-up pictures of her vagina. He says at one point she complies. At one point she sends him a picture, but obviously she's nervous, anxious. She doesn't want to do this, but she does it just for him. And at one point he texts her back and he says, "You're not smiling. Take the picture again and then send it to me." It's an exercise to push women out of their comfort zone, to conquer their fears, as the NXIVM Cult sold it. This is all making them a better person, when in reality, it's just sexual abuse. Keith tells India at one point that he's going to work on her. And how he does that is he instructs her to go to his condo, wait for him there. He comes, he says, "Please be," doesn't say please. He says, "Be completely naked when I get there." And essentially his way of working on her is he proceeds to give her oral sex, which she did not ask for, she didn't want. And she says what was weird about it, India shares that she looks down and she sees that Keith Rainere is not aroused during this session. So in her mind, she thought, well, maybe there is some legitimacy to him trying to help me. I mean, he's not even aroused. I mean, that's how much manipulation she was under. It's so sad. It was so sad to hear her say that, because this is rape. Let's not mince words. This was not a sexual encounter. This was nothing else but rape, psychological and physical rape. But India doesn't realize at the time a crime was committed against her. At one point in the docuseries, they talk about a woman named Daniela X, which I don't think is her real name. Her family had moved from Mexico and they were deeply involved in NXIVM. She, at one point, while she's in NXIVM, she confesses that she's got a crush on someone and it's not Keith. Well, this enrages Keith, and so he punishes her. He orders her to be confined inside of a condo. He had another member of NXIVM watching her the entire time in order to enforce the confinement, and this lasted almost 2 years. Eventually, they took this woman, Daniela X. They dropped her off at the Mexican border with no documents, no identification. They just let her out. Luckily, she was let out and she survived that terrible ordeal. But what the fuck? Like, how cold do you have to be to treat a human being in that way? And all because she had a crush on somebody who wasn't fucking Keith Rainere. I just was flabbergasted. There was another woman who came forward who said that she was 12 years old when Keith began a sexual relationship with her. But again, let's not mince words. This is rape of a child. This is sexual abuse of a child. And I'm sorry if that sounds harsh. I hope that people heeded the trigger warning at the beginning, but this is not a relationship. The children cannot consent to a relationship with an adult. Their minds, their brains are not fully formed. They are not mature enough to actually be able to give their consent. So even if they're saying, I was in a relationship with this person who was an adult, it's not a relationship. It is not a consensual relationship because children cannot consent. Let's make that clear. At one point, there was a really disturbing, all of this is disturbing, but Rainere is teaching a class and he's teaching members about the age of consent and how it differs in various parts of the world. And he justifies it saying some children are adult-like and perfectly happy with it. And again, no, motherfucker. Children are not perfectly happy with any relationship with an adult. It is inappropriate, it's illegal, and children cannot make that decision. So you cannot twist what the reality of this situation is. That is sexual abuse of a child. That's what it is. One victim who came forward, and this was absolutely heartbreaking, she said that she and her 2 sisters were impregnated by Keith Rainere and encouraged to have abortions. I imagine this happened on more than a few occasions. He was sexually assaulting, raping so many women and minors that this had to have happened more times than we even know about. It's just so disturbing. All right, so this next part that I want to get into, this was really hard for me to watch. And I imagine it will be really hard for you all who are watching this video and listening to this podcast to hear. So I'm just going to give a trigger warning, another one here. I'm about to talk about something extremely disturbing involving a baby. And it's not something that actually happened to a baby. It's just Keith Rainere talking about a baby in a really horrible way. So just letting you know, it's only going to last for no more than a minute. So if you want to fast forward here, you can. But at one point in the docuseries, they show video footage of Rainere again speaking to a packed class about, basically he says, and this is his quote, about a baby, okay? He's talking about a baby specifically. And he says, what if it was just a lump of flesh and you're primitive and you just want to stick your dick inside? I have seen and heard a lot of highly disturbing things in my career in this genre. And that was the most disgusting, disturbing thing that I have ever heard come out of any person's mouth. And just the rage that I was filled with. This man deserves every fucking thing that I hope is happening to him in prison. And I'd really try not to be that person, but fuck this guy. I just don't know where to go with that. So we'll just move on. But the one thing I will say is that obviously Rainere was really dead set and determined to soften people up, to accept the absolute worst case scenario that could ever happen to a human being, a child nonetheless. He's just really wanting people to get on board with him being able to do any sick thing that he wanted to a human being, even if it was a child. In 2016, all of the DOS slaves are told that they are going to need to recruit their own slaves. So you can see how this is a pyramid scheme. Like Allison Mack was a master. She had first line slaves. Those first line slaves are told, go get your own slaves. And then I guess you become the master of those slaves, and so on and so on and so on. So essentially, they're sent out to recruit more people to become slaves and fall under them. Essentially, they're downline, if we're talking in MLM terms. And they would call it a women's group. So if I were a slave within DOS and I wanted to recruit somebody, I would kind of be somewhere at a coffee shop, or I don't know where, and I would just be like, oh, hey, you should really join this really supportive women's group that I'm a part of. We're very deeply supportive of one another, and let me tell you about it. And that's how you sort of get women to come in. But of course, it's not a deeply supportive women's group. It is a master-slave relationship. And the slaves are told they need to create a list of people that they could recruit into DOS. And Allison is asking them for pictures of potential recruits so she can see their faces for approval. And again, she's probably just sending those pictures to Keith so he can say yes, no, yes, no. He's looking for attractive, thin women. And, besides the part where Allison's asking for pictures of faces for approval, the pressure to recruit is just so much like an MLM. At one point, Allison informs India about the branding, but she sold it as a bonding experience. When in reality, India, over 30 minutes of excruciating pain, another member of NXIVM used a cauterizing pen to brand Keith Rainere's initials onto her body. But at the time, none of the women who were being branded in this way were told that these are Keith's initials. That was kept totally secret. They told them that this is going to be like a symbol of the elements and we're all getting it and we're all going to bond. It's a sisterhood. I mean, it's just absolutely disgusting. She was given no painkillers, no numbing cream, no anesthesia, and she's being essentially maimed. Her body is being disfigured with a cauterizing pen for 30 agonizing minutes. And Keith, at one point, he remarks about India's branding. He says that, oh, I like how it's healing and I like how tiny you looked. I just want to vomit. I hate him. Around 2016, 2017, there was a lady named Bonnie. Now, she had left NXIVM and she called India's mother, Catherine, and she warns her that she needed to save her daughter from this cult. And she told her all about DOS, which was supposed to be kept highly secret. She says that India is being sleep deprived. She's in a master-slave arrangement. She's being starved. Her body's been branded with Keith Rainere's initials. So Catherine Oxenberg, India's mother, is absolutely alarmed and afraid, and she's desperate to get her daughter out. She's fearful that her daughter might die by suicide. I mean, it's just gotten so bad and detrimental to her health. In 2016, by this time, India has been in NXIVM for 6 years. She's been in DOS for a year and a half. And at this time, Allison informs India that the third tier slaves are going to be branded. And India is extremely anxious about this because she does not want to brand her slaves. I don't even think she wanted slaves to begin with, but she was just being loyal and doing what she was told. And so she's really fearful that now these women are going to have to go through the pain that she did. So it just gives her a lot of anxiety. At one point, India's mom, Catherine, tricks India into coming home to Los Angeles under the guise that she was going to be flying to LA to celebrate her birthday, India's birthday. But really, this was an intervention. And India doesn't know that her mom at this time knows everything because Bonnie, the former NXIVM member, had told her about it. So she gets India to LA and she makes her an appointment with the OBGYN right away because she wants to make sure that her daughter's okay after knowing what she's gone through. So India goes to the appointment, but on the way there, Catherine is driving her there. Catherine asks her daughter if she's branded. She just couldn't help herself. Like, she just spills the beans and she's like, "Are you branded?" And India looks at her and says, "Yes." And Catherine says, "You know that those are Keith's initials in the branding, right?" And India is just in complete denial because, of course, she's been told that it's just a symbol of the elements. She had no idea that they were Keith Rainere's initials she'd been branded with. So the conversation doesn't go well. Of course, India is feeling very angry and defensive. And Catherine does, in fact, drop her off at her doctor appointment. When India gets to the doctor is already informed ahead of time what India is currently going through. Catherine had told the doctor everything. So she's trying to get the doctor to help her get her daughter out of this cult. And the doctor tells India, please don't go back to Albany after this. And at one point, the doctor moves India's hand away from her branding so that she can expose the branding. And India is so angry about this, because when her mom picked her up, she finds out essentially that her mom had told the doctor everything. And again, she's feeling very defensive and pissed off at her mom for exposing her. And she felt set up, is what she says in the docuseries. You know, NXIVM at this point just really had a strong chokehold on India. I mean, she would have done anything. She thought that she was doing good things for herself and for the organization as a whole. So India does, unfortunately, end up going back to Albany, back to NXIVM, and she goes through a long period of not speaking with her mother after that incident, the failed intervention. And of course, the cult tells India that her mother is just interrupting her progress, and that she should distance herself from the enemy, her mother. At one point, you know, Catherine Oxenberg, to her credit, does not give up on her daughter, and she is determined to get her out of this cult. And she tells anybody and everybody who will listen to her. She contacts her ex-partner, which is India's biological father. She tells him about it, but she ends up feeling alone after that conversation. So then she even calls judges. She goes to the FBI. She goes to the New York State Police, who in turn ask her, is your daughter over 18? Well, if she is, there's really nothing we can do. And there really aren't good laws in the United States surrounding coercive control. The laws in Europe are quite a bit more advanced when it comes to coercive control. So Catherine doesn't give up. She ends up reaching out to NXIVM's former PR guy, Frank. She tells him about the branding, and Frank ends up reporting about the branding in what was called the Frank Report. And this blows up the NXIVM story. The branding, there's a picture of one of the NXIVM cult victims, I'll say, not even member at this point, but they're all, you know, a victim of this cult. She's exposing her branding for all to see in the Frank Report. And around this time, well, basically the post brings on a ton of questions. And after the Frank Report came out, the DOS slaves, they start to defect from DOS and from NXIVM. This still wasn't enough to get India to break free from NXIVM. She stays in NXIVM, she stays in DOS. And that's probably because she had been indoctrinated into this cult for a much longer period of time than a lot of these other people. And also, she was indoctrinated at a very young age. And there's actually an expert who comes on and talks about how the human brain is really not fully formed until about the age of 25. And India started within this cult in her early 20s. So I'm sure that that really is the reason that she was just so in it, so deep, and so hesitant to leave. So meanwhile, Catherine is just agonizing over her daughter. She's fearing for her safety, and she doesn't want to do it, but she knows that going public with her story is the only way that she could potentially get India to leave this cult. And that's exactly what she does. She takes her story to the press and just blows this thing wide open. She ends up talking to Barry Meyer with the New York Times. And so Barry writes a New York Times article. And at the same time that the New York Times article hit, it was around the time that Harvey Weinstein and the Me Too movement were very prevalent in the media. And so this actually aids in blowing up the NXIVM story. And again, like I said earlier, there's a former member, a victim of this cult, who actually poses for a picture and shows her branding in this New York Times article. And people are just going wild with this story. They're in shock and they're just flabbergasted by this. At this time, NXIVM and all the higher ups are getting really paranoid about their story getting out. They instruct all the members to delete anything DOS related, messages or any other type of evidence, because they just want no record of DOS ever existing. And India was really pissed off at her mom during this time because her mom spoke publicly about her daughter's lack of a period for over a year, her hair loss. I mean, her mother is just trying to get out all the gory details so that people will be shocked enough to take action. And Oxenberg decides to do another round of media. She does talk show interviews. And all the while, India wants her mom to stop talking about her. She thought she was fine during this time. Board members and executives from NXIVM are sending threatening letters to Catherine Oxenberg. And Oxenberg, during this time, she does fear for her safety. She fears she might be harmed or killed. But she knows that she's safer. She'll keep herself safer if she stays in the public eye, because if something happened to her, it would be really suspicious and they would go straight to NXIVM because they would think like, okay, this lady's spoken out about this organization, so they clearly had something to do with her death. At this time also, NXIVM makes India write a public letter, and basically she's telling the world, I'm okay. I'm just fine. You don't have to worry about me. I'm happy. And of course, it's all bullshit and it's all coerced. I mean, she's forced to write this letter. And of course, Rainere writes his own public letter sharing that he's not even involved in NXIVM. He's distancing himself. But of course, that would later come to bite him in the ass. The U.S. attorney in New York reads the New York Times article and is extremely alarmed and thinks that this is probably something criminal that's happening within NXIVM. And she starts reaching out to former NXIVM members, gathering evidence of blackmail, kidnapping, coercion, assault, conducting illegal experiments without consent. And at this time, Catherine Oxenberg learns that the federal prosecutors are pursuing charges against Keith Rainere. And so a weight is lifted off of her shoulders because she no longer has to sort of do her own investigation and try to get him locked up. The federal prosecutors are going to pursue charges. In November of 2017, like the little bitch that he is, Rainere flees to Mexico. And India at this time, this is when she first starts feeling the need to leave NXIVM because she's seeing everybody, all the members of NXIVM are just scattering like cockroaches because of everything going public. So people are starting to leave the cult. And so India gets the clue that like, hey, I think it's time for me to make my exit as well. In 2018, India moves in with Allison Mack in Brooklyn. She's still in DOS at this time, and she's doing check-ins with Allison. She's still calorie counting. And during this time, she says that Allison Mack was extremely paranoid because, the walls were sort of caving in on people who were involved in NXIVM, especially the higher ups. At one point in the docuseries, I got chills from this, but Catherine Oxenberg, India's mom, is sitting on a stoop outside of a home in Brooklyn, and she's posing for a magazine photo. And she doesn't know it at the time, but she's literally sitting on a stoop right outside of Allison Mack's home, which was where her daughter was living at the time, but she didn't know it. She didn't know where her daughter was. So here she is posing for this picture. Come to find out later, her daughter was just right inside those walls. The media, just after they caught wind of this story, they kept showing up at India's work. At this time, she was a manager at a cafe in Brooklyn. She couldn't get an apartment or roommates. She was trying to move out of Allison's condo, but people wouldn't rent to her. People didn't want to live with her because she was that cult girl. In February of 2018, this is when everything starts to crumble for NXIVM. A judge issues an arrest warrant for Keith Rainere, so federal prosecutors now have to go and find him. Meanwhile, they didn't know it, but they would find out pretty quickly that Keith was hiding out in Mexico. Meanwhile, while all of this is coming crashing down and he's essentially on the run, Keith summons all of the line slaves down to Mexico for a recommitment and devotion ceremony. What does he do during this ceremony? He orders a group blowjob. I just really have no words, and that's rare. Nikki Klein is one of the DOS members at this time. She's in Mexico after being summoned by Keith Rainere. She stupidly posts a picture of herself and some of the other members on Instagram of her in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. There are landmarks that are visible in the shot, and that's exactly how authorities are able to track Keith Rainere and all of his slaves down in Mexico, thanks to that picture. So the federal authorities, they enlist the federales in Mexico to apprehend and extradite Keith back to the U.S. On March 27th of 2018, the federales show up where Keith was hiding out with machine guns. And of course, Keith's hiding in the closet like a little bitch. And the story breaks and Keith is deported to the United States. Now, in the indictment documents, there are 2 co-conspirators who are named in addition to Keith Rainere. They call them CC1 and CC2, meaning co-conspirator 1, co-conspirator 2. They don't name names at that time, but you can tell, people could tell who the co-conspirators were just by the description. For example, they knew that CC1 was Allison Mack because they said she's described as being an actress. And then people could tell that co-conspirator 2 was India Oxenberg. And Catherine's deeply worried at this time about her daughter's fate because now she's being named as a co-conspirator for very serious crimes. And Catherine reaches out to India by text, but India doesn't respond. And in 2018, the FBI visits India while she's still living at Allison's condo. But while Allison is in Mexico with Keith, they visit India and she invites them in and she talks to them for like 3 hours. When Allison does come home from Mexico, the FBI fairly quickly moves in on her condo and they arrest her for sex trafficking. Claire Bronfman, who is the heir to the Seagram's liquor fortune, she's also arrested and her bail was set at $100 million, which set a huge precedence and people were so relieved. That was the highest bail that had ever been reported, I think. And I don't know. I didn't look it up, but it's a fucking really high bail. Nancy Salzman, the president of NXIVM, was also arrested, and investigators found hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash at her home. Salzman's daughter was also, who was first line DOS, was also charged. And some of the charges that these cult members were being charged with were racketeering, sex trafficking, conspiracy, wire fraud, and so much more. After Allison Mack's arrest, India does end up reaching out to her mother, Catherine, and agrees to meet with her mother's attorney. The attorney goes on to explain to India the indictment page by page. And this is when India finally starts to grasp the seriousness of the situation. After Allison's arrest, India is in the process of moving out of her condo and she finds some of Allison's stuff. And per Allison's mom's request, India moves some of her stuff out of the condo because, Allison's in jail pending her trial date. And at this time, India finds flash drives and she doesn't think anything of it. She tosses them in her backpack. Later on, she decides, I think I should pull these out and check out what's on these flash drives. When she does, she hears Keith Rainere essentially designing and instructing DOS, including talk and planning about the branding that the slaves would have to do. And he says on these flash drives in these recordings, he says, this is an order, not a democracy. So clearly from his own voice, which of course would later be used against him at trial, he's saying you don't have free will. I am ordering you to do certain things. I am ordering you to have your body disfigured because that's what I want. So India, after listening to what's on these flash drives, she realizes that she's got significant evidence and she needs to turn it over. And that's exactly what she does. She turns it over to the prosecution and she starts to work with them and agrees to testify against everyone else who's being charged. And really that's what happens a lot in these cases. It's like, who's going to be the fastest to make a deal? And good on her that she was able to do it and sort of turn state's witness and give them all the information that they needed and start to cooperate with them because it's going to work out well for her. In May of 2017, Rainere goes on trial in the case of the USA versus Rainere. And Rainere's the only one, of course, who pleaded not guilty to all of his charges, including sex trafficking and racketeering. And apparently he had a really good legal team as well. Allison Mack and Claire Bronfman ended up pleading guilty to their charges. At trial, we learned that Allison was not being paid at one point by Keith when she was a proctor. And this was in 2016. And apparently it was because he wanted her to deliver India and she hadn't delivered this person yet. So really what was happening is Keith is withholding money from Allison until she's able to successfully traffic India Oxenberg to deliver her to him. It just is absolutely disgusting. At one point, they interview Keith Rainere's defense attorney, and it was kind of disturbing what he said. He says, "It's like a summer camp for orgasms," and then he laughs. And apparently the defense was extremely ruthless during trial, cross-examining the state's witnesses. I did not like that comment by this defense attorney. Now, I may be taking it out of context. They probably didn't show the entirety of his interview, but he did really slough off this cult and all of this sexual abuse as just being like a summer camp for orgasms when really women and children were being raped. So I don't take kindly to that. I do understand that defense attorneys have a job to do and they are supposed to defend their clients, but that comment wasn't necessary and it was really ignorant. Now, as much as Keith Rainere tried to distance himself when everything started to implode and say, "Oh, I'm not even involved in NXIVM," and not even acknowledging that DOS exists. Oh, but the U.S. attorney has this motherfucker on tape. So he's saying things, he's talking about branding on tape, and all of this was played at trial for the jury. He's talking about the branding ceremony. He's talking about the collateral that they took. He's saying the word master and talking about the slaves. And of course, this countered the defense's argument that this was all consensual and that Keith Rainere wasn't even involved. I mean, that obviously is a bunch of bullshit if you hear these tapes. And really what it boils down to for NXIVM, Keith Rainere, it was all about power and control. And that is really what he wanted: ultimate power and control over every single person that he could get his hands on. And India talks about how she has panic attacks after this, especially in regard to the collateral that she gave up. She has no idea where that collateral is, what could ever be done with it, if it could ever be exposed. That is something she'll have to go to her grave with, knowing that those family secrets and maybe photos and videos of her are just out there. She doesn't know where they are, or whose hands they're in, and if they could ever get out, and just further victimize her. During the trial, India was never allowed in the courtroom because she was being held as a potential state's witness because she was supposed to testify against some of the other conspirators, some of the other defendants. And but she's eventually told that she actually doesn't need to testify, so she decides to go to the closing arguments. And it's there that she sees Keith Rainere for the first time after everything imploded, after she's left the cult. And, she's talking about having nightmares leading up to this day that she's going to go to court, nightmares about seeing Keith Rainere. Anyway, I thought this was so interesting because India talks about seeing Keith in the courtroom for the first time and saying, like, oh my God, all of a sudden, like, this person that I held up so high and who I just thought was like the ultimate was so small and insignificant when I looked at him in this courtroom. He probably looked pathetic to her. And not to not to minimize the situation, but it made me think of like a brief relationship I was in before I got married. I was single, and I look back on that relationship and I'm like, oh my God, like I definitely would not date that person today. But at that time I was fresh off of a divorce, and I was like vulnerable and hadn't dated anybody in a long time, and yada, yada, yada. So, but I remember now, like now looking back going, oh, hell no, like just no. But I, was in a brief relationship with this person and, saw something in them at that time. But when I had like my clear glasses on, so to speak, like I was like, ooh, yeah, no. So I understood sort of what she was saying, that like for so many years, Keith was just the ultimate. She probably saw him as so big and so significant. Whereas now she sees this pathetic person in the courtroom, and he's this fucking tiny man who, and I'm sorry, I'm so not trying to size shame or height shame. I can't. This guy, the jokes just write themselves with this guy. If you Google him, he is just a turd. Just a little troll. He's not a looker. He's not anything to lay eyes on. Anyway, I could understand what she was feeling at that time, seeing this stupid guy in the courtroom who told everybody he was a genius and yada yada, and he's just a dumbass scam artist, sexual predator, and an ugly one at that. In June of 2019, after a 6-week trial, the jury began deliberating, and they found Rainere guilty. It took them only 4 hours to come to this verdict, and everyone just felt so much relief. But India, I'm sure she felt relieved, but she was also in shock over this because she was still trying to process everything that had happened. Catherine and India Oxenberg end up repairing their relationship, which I was so happy to see. I'm a mother of daughters, and it just like broke my heart that she couldn't reach her daughter for the longest time, and that her daughter just seemed to be slipping further and further and further away from her. So I was so happy to see that they had repaired their relationship and that India survived this experience. I mean, that very well could have ended. I have no doubt that if this cult would have kept going, there would have been some deaths for sure, with the malnourishment, the mental health decline that people must have been experiencing, the sexual abuse trauma, just all the things. I just can't even imagine where it would have gone. India ends up tattooing over her branding, and her tattoo says "still learning," which is appropriate for her because she describes in the documentary that she is still on a learning journey. She's still trying to learn to trust herself and other people after what she experienced in the cult. She has major trust issues. India talks about it, and she says she even struggles to trust herself. Her fiance, Patrick, started to cook real food for her, and that was different for her because within NXIVM, she was forced into an eating disorder. She was malnourished and could only eat 500 calories a day. She had to learn to eat properly and nutritiously and healthily all over again. And apparently her fiance Patrick helped her do that. And it's a little off topic, but it's on the topic of the docuseries. I thought it was interesting that India Oxenberg's mother, Catherine Oxenberg, her mother, so this would be India's grandmother, is this beautiful, strikingly beautiful older woman. And her name on the placard or whatever the hell it's called in this docuseries is Princess Olivia of Yugoslavia. So of course I went down the rabbit hole and I was like, how is she a princess? And it was a little like twice removed type deal, but apparently she is Princess Olivia of Yugoslavia. I thought that was very interesting. And again, like I said during the beginning of this recording, the self-help industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry that is unregulated. And if you sit back and think about it, Scientology is the first to come to mind. So many scams and cults and predatory organizations and people, gurus, they prey on people's vulnerabilities in this space. I just feel like that's just human instinct for us to want to be a better person, to push past our fears and our discomforts and our vulnerabilities, push past our trauma. And a lot of people could easily fall into these self-help manipulative organizations And you can just see how that industry in particular is just peppered with scam artists and cult-like behavior. The parallels between NXIVM and Scientology and MLMs, I'm sure you could think of it, even Jonestown and Waco, even though, everybody didn't die at the end. There's so many parallels. And the one common denominator, in my opinion, is that these are all either cults or like cult adjacent. And I'm trying to be nice here. That's the common denominator, I think, between all of those organizations that I just mentioned. In October of 2020, Keith Rainere is sentenced to 120 years in prison. So he'll never walk free again. And, but that said, he still has NXIVM loyalists who still practice readiness drills, and a group of them actually started dancing beneath Keith Rainere's prison cell window in Brooklyn. And I'm sorry, but they show video of these people dancing and doing like backflips under this dumbass's prison cell window. And they just look like a bunch of fucking idiots. I'm sorry. You just look so stupid. At this point, if you are still a Keith Rainere loyalist, fuck off. And your stupid dances really aren't going to get you anywhere. But you ain't going to blow up on TikTok. You're not going to, stop. It's just so much cringe that I feel when you watch these people doing backflips for Keith Rainere. It's wild. And Nikki Klein is one of those loyalists. She's the one who was stupid enough to take that picture in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, who got Keith Rainere caught. But she's out there doing backflips under his prison cell window. Claire Bronfman, so one of the Bronfman sisters, the heir to this, one of the heirs to the Seagram's fortune, she ends up being sentenced to 81 months in prison, and she's fined $6.5 million, which I don't know if I agree with that sentence, but moving on. September of 2021, Nancy Salzman, who was the co-founder of NXIVM, the president of NXIVM, and Keith's little bitch, she faced up to 20 years in prison for the charges that she was convicted of. She was only sentenced to 42 months in prison and a $150,000 fine. Now that pissed me off. I thought I would love to read through the evidence because that just does not seem like that is nearly enough time for what she did. Moving on though. Lauren Salzman, who is Nancy Salzman's daughter, she faced up to 40 years in prison. She ends up getting 5 years probation and 300 hours of community service. That's just a slap in the face. Allison Mack, the actress from Smallville and, Keith Rainere's right hand at times, she was sentenced to 3 years in prison, and that's it. So, yes, some people were made to pay for what they did within this cult. Certainly others got away with it, or really it was just kind of, they got sentenced, but it wasn't harsh enough in my opinion. But I guess that's just the way things go. I'm happy that Keith Rainere is going to be in prison for the rest of his life. That's absolutely where he deserves to be. If he were to be free tomorrow, there's no doubt in my mind that he would go and try to do the same thing, just in another place with new people. All right, you guys. So make sure you're following me here on YouTube and subscribe to the channel. If you're listening to the podcast, make sure you're subscribed. You can listen to the podcast. It's in the Murderish podcast feed. So every Serial Streamers episode is dropped in the Murderish podcast feed every other Friday. And it's also dropped every 2 weeks on YouTube. So subscribe and follow, whether you're listening, watching, whatever, so that you don't miss any new episodes. And make sure you're following me on Instagram at Jami on Air, because that is where everything goes down. That's where the Serial Streamers TV Club meets. We virtually meet on Instagram. I'll put out a post and I'll open up the chat after we've had a chance to watch a true crime docuseries, and then we all just talk about it. And it's been a lot of fun. It has been really engaging. I'm super happy with people engaging and sharing their thoughts. There's been no drama, and I will squash it if there is. I did have to block a dude recently because he was trying to. So I covered the Mary Kay Letourneau case, which is the teacher who was convicted of sex crimes against one of her students, who she says, they entered into a consensual relationship. The problem was, his name's Villy, was only 12 when they entered into that relationship, which obviously cannot be considered a consensual relationship because he's a kid. Anyway, it's the Mary Kay Letourneau case. It's a very a highly publicized case. I covered that one, and this guy got on Instagram and he was kind of like Keith Rainere. He kept commenting and commenting and commenting and giving me all these examples of how in this country, the age of consent is 15, and they have, Jerry Lee Lewis and Elvis Presley. They had relations with. Basically, he's okay with adults having relations with children. So I blocked his ass, and that was the only drama. But that was just between me and him. But yeah, I'm not going to put up with drama. It's going to be civil, and if it's not, then I will deal with that. So again, like I said at the top of this recording, every couple of weeks I will go to Instagram and I will announce the Serial Streamers watch assignment, and then I'll give you about a week to watch it. Then about a week later, I will drop an episode on the Murderish podcast feed about that docuseries, and I will also drop it on YouTube. And then I will go to Instagram and I will open up the chat, and then like all of us will just talk about that docuseries. It's a lot of fun. The cycle repeats every couple of weeks, so make sure you're tuned in to Instagram. You're following me there because that's where it kind of all goes down. You guys, thanks so much for listening. Thanks so much for watching. I'm really excited about this Serial Streamers Club. I'm totally enjoying it. I hope you are too. Tell a friend, follow, subscribe, and I will see you all in a couple of weeks. Bye.